All right. Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today is a special live stream event, something I haven't been able to do for a while. But we're going to be having a friendly, informal discussion between Dr. Trevor Lohman on the bottom there. Hey, Trevor, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I feel like I haven't seen you in forever. Like it's at least a week since you were on the
Yeah,
show.
it does feel like there's some time dilation going on. It's too much. We're too busy.
Absolutely.
Tends to make time go by in a weird way.
Awesome, awesome. And joining me is another returning guest, although it has been a while since you were on the show, the atheist Darren Lute. So, hey, Darren, how are you?
No, Trevor didn't get a the theist.
Yeah, the
He's
the
representing the
believer,
Christian.
Trevor.
But the Christian position's just assumed on this show that they're going to be present, right? So,
Yes,
I just
I have
figured
a
you needed to
I
go
have
ahead.
to know how you guys know each other because like I have I would say a large portion of my circle of like colleagues and friends are atheists just by virtue of the work I do and being atheist myself for so long until recently. So how do you guys know each other?
yeah,
Uh,
Darren, if you want to tell the story or you want me to.
uh, Dale was the host of Skeptics and Seekers
Okay.
for a long time, and I was the one that made fun of him on the boards.
Okay, gotcha,
He
gotcha.
was my arch nemesis. Yeah.
Gotcha. It's
Uh,
good to have someone like that to keep you sharp. Yeah, I like that. Very nice.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
So So Darren, I'll just let people know that me and Darren are actually preparing. It's probably going to be in the new year, just because I've got so much on my plate right now. But a debate on the existence of God, and I'll be presenting what I think are the three best arguments. And it's one of those arguments, an argument for God from consciousness, that really was kind of a motivation for this show. When I heard Trevor was involved in neuroscience as a professional, I like, hey, let's get a great discussion going on the topic of neuroscience and consciousness there. So yeah, with
Yeah, I
that
mean,
said, go
I
ahead.
should maybe like a little point of clarification just to describe my background. So I do clinical neuroscience research. So for folks who probably don't understand the distinction, I work with I study human disease of the brain, mostly Alzheimer's disease, other causes of dementia, vascular contributions to Alzheimer's and dementia. So it's not really. I think I've seen some like YouTube neuroscientist guys who are definitely really in the thick of the philosophical side of neuroscience. And I think more of the kind of the medical neuroscience community, which I would sort of describe myself as being in, maybe subconsciously views that with like a little bit of skepticism in general because it feels a little maybe religious, like quasi religious, a sort of like neuroscientific study of, you know, free will and
Mm.
consciousness. And so that's kind of where that's the perspective I sort of come from when I look at this. And that is really what I'd say is the core kind of tenets of my book is not so much that you can use neuroscience to prove that God exists or prove that free will exists, although I think you can have interesting conversations about that. My perspective is more that um, the current consensus neuroscientific opinions about what consciousness is are religious and pseudoscientific. And I think you can sort of walk through and demonstrate that if you have a somewhat charitable position. I mean, if your position is just that no, they use MRI, therefore they're scientists, well then, yeah, I guess they are. But if your view is more like some of these claims are non-falsifiable, some of these aren't really testable, some of these are overinterpreted, I think it's pretty easy if you're willing to view some of these sort of claims that consciousness is an emergent property, which is a problematic word in and of itself. I think you can view those with some reasonable skepticism as being sort of quasi religious. Anyway, so that's sort of the ideas that I try to outline in the book.
Awesome, awesome. All right. Well, yeah. At this point, what I'll do as the host is for the next, at least half an hour or so, again, depending on how you guys are going, I'm going to step out of the way as the host and let Trevor and Darren kind of have just an informal discussion. No structure, no formal anything like that. But yeah, Darren, you're familiar with Trevor's notions about consciousness. So what would you like to discuss with him?
Actually, I'm vaguely familiar with Trevor's notions. I've seen a review of his book that sort of goes through everything that he went through, but that's a lot different than actually knowing what his stance is. So I think what I'd like to do first is just sort of, are you okay, Trevor, if I just ask you a bunch of questions
Sure.
to
Yeah.
see
Oh boy.
where we're
Let's do it.
starting?
Sure.
Okay, so you just said that your book was sort of about you don't like the methodology of the science because you call it religious, which I'm assuming in that sense you're using religious as a pejorative.
No,
to-
no. So like I think this is actually maybe a great point of clarification we could start with. I think it's important, especially in like this kind of context, to divide things up into beliefs and scientific claims.
so
And
the
so
map versus the territory type thing.
kind of, but not even really that. Like I think something can be a belief, and that doesn't mean it's well, let me try to come up. I like analogies. Some people don't like them, but like for example, I believe I'm a good person, I think, right? And so I wouldn't characterize that as like a scientific claim. We can maybe the three of us kind of devise some experiments perhaps to like surprise me with like some type of situation to see if I do the right thing, but ultimately like we may not even agree on what good means or what it means to be a good person. It's subjective. And
Yeah,
so I think you
semantic.
can, yeah, I think you can make the argument that it's non-falsifiable. And so like by definition, non-falsifiable claims are not scientific claims or beliefs. And so when it comes to God, I try to think like, well, can I make a scientific claim for God? So I kind of try to imagine, and hearing what you guys were talking about in the beginning, you might like this, you might not, but I like to imagine a world like 100 years from now, maybe 10, who knows, where, we're able to create these like truly conscious, I guess beings or something, programming, AI, call it AI, but they're aware, they're sentient, they have free will, or they believe they do. And we're able to put them inside of a hard drive and watch them. And it's like, well, we're kind of in another dimension from them, right? Because they're just information on a processor. They're not aware of that. Like they're not aware of their true nature. They just see themselves like we see each other, like people. And we could even, as their creators, right? We could even like speed up the processor. And so now 1,000 years in there, it's like a day for us. And so we could just watch them move through the technological revolutions. And you could imagine someday three guys like us are looking at each other and one of them goes, you know what? I think somebody created us. I think we're living inside of a created universe and that this isn't real. And somewhere out there is our creator. And, he'd technically be correct. That would be correct in this made up hypothetical scenario, but it'd be completely non falsifiable. His buddies would probably laugh at him. They'd say, well, you can't test that, and they'd be right too. And so I think there's beliefs and then there's scientific claims. And in that case, that guy has a belief that is true, but it's non falsifiable. And I actually, so I kind of just try to put those things in separate boxes. I believe in God. I believe in that consciousness is some meaningful thing. It's not computation. But I don't really presume to be able to demonstrate it with science. And I actually would make the argument that the folks who do, the neuroscientists who do, are similarly kind of enacting their beliefs with science. They're sort of over-interpreting results, and they're kind of putting forth non-falsifiable claims. So anyway, I don't know if that helps explain my position, but I think it's useful to separate those two things.
Yeah, I think I got it. So you would define unfalsifiable as I'm guessing sort of like a testable claim that where you make a prediction of something you don't know in the future, and if the prediction comes true, or if the prediction doesn't come true, then the hypothesis would be falsified. Would that be when you
I
say
mean,
unfalsifiable?
yeah, I think if I had a claim, like if I had what I was putting forward as a scientific claim, that consciousness emerges from computation, I would want I wouldn't really consider that a scientific claim unless I could outline for you how it could be disproven, either now or in the future with some new technology. So,
Okay.
yeah. So,
And how are you defining consciousness?
I think this is the $1 million question. Um, man, this is a major limitation of language, I
I
think.
know, right?
but there's two sort of definitions that are kind of appealing to me. One is just like the medical definition, which is like, man, there's clearly something different between someone who's awake and someone who's under general anesthesia, right? But I think that's kind of like maybe a lazy definition. Although scientifically, I think it's useful. I actually kind of like some of the people studying consciousness who use that definition because it's very objective. It's very clean cut. But no, I kind of have maybe more just a subjective definition, which means it's a bad definition technically. But clearly I feel like I'm in here, experiencing my thoughts and my thinking. And I realize that I'm distinct from out there, and I'm aware of the things out there and all of the sensory input that's coming into my brain. I'm experiencing it and I'm aware of it. So when I say I'm experiencing it, I think that's an important aspect of what consciousness is. It's like a driver in a car. It's not, I mean, you can kind of think of like, a camera being like an analog to an eye. Totally makes sense, right? Lens, aperture, sensor, boom. Then it's like, okay, where does that information feed into? Well, in the case of a camera, nowhere, but you could imagine plugging it into like ChatGPT and saying, ChatGPT, what do you see? And it'd say, oh, I see a bird, right? If that's what you took a picture of. But then the question is like, does ChatGPT see the bird the way I see the bird, or does it have a algorithmic, if there's pixels arranged in this configuration, then I know that's associated with my training data set of birds, and therefore I know to say bird. Is there that agency? Is there that experiential quality? I mean, it's non-falsifiable. You can't test it. I mean, it's a belief. So I don't know, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, I think there's a few things that we sort of have to get over first. I mean, if no one knows the definition of consciousness, then it's sort of hard to say what predictions or how, what it even is you're talking about if you can't really define it. And that's sort of the biggest hurdle. But in fact, I remember David is the other host of SNS, and then we were on the boards one time. We were talking about LLMs, and he defined consciousness. And so I pointed out different AIs that did exactly what he was saying, defined consciousness. There's a game called that played StarCraft, and it was like I forget what they called it, but it was DeepMind, and it learned the game all by itself, and it had an entire map of the game in its internal working, so it was aware of everything that was going on in the game and all the things that you move around and everything. Well, so if your idea of consciousness is being aware of your surroundings, and the AI obviously was aware of everything that was going on in this game, then if you don't have a really concrete idea of what consciousness is, then does that count?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and then now we've just moved the problem to a new word, which is aware. Like I my Dodge Ram beeps if I get too close to a curb, so it's aware of its surroundings. But I would never presume to say it's a conscious free agent. So yeah, I mean, this is like we're totally kicking the can around trying to define these words. But that might be the most important part of this whole discussion is like, just what are we even talking about? So I think the problem, from a scientific perspective, which is why I say right off the bat, these aren't scientific claims, so they can't be. But right off the bat, I think we would have to agree that consciousness is some type of subjective experience. It's not, at least with current technology, it's not testable. And we're building consciousness, emulating machines right now. And they're designed to mimic consciousness perfectly. And so then it really complicates the problem. Like, how do we tell? And I think you can't. I mean, I cannot physically I don't know that you're both conscious, like without reason. I can't, go into your mind and see if you experience the world just like I do. But I agree, there are tests, there are ways to sort of tell, but that's getting more complicated now with AI. It's very interesting times.
And that actually brings up another question, because you're saying that you're comparing the AI to you, but if you don't know how you have consciousness, then how would you recognize if the AI was doing the same thing that you're doing?
It's totally non-falsifiable. And I think that is like, this is the most interesting part of all of this. Now, one difference I would say, but again, this is I can't know this for sure, is it feels real to me. And I know kind of like the neuroscientific atheist perspective, not even really atheist perspective, just a neuroscientific perspective is like, well, that's an illusion. And I get it. I get it, but it's like, it's an illusion for who? Who's the illusion for? Who is experiencing the illusion? And so just the fact that you have to create this illusion for something kind of makes me feel like it exists. But
Well,
you're right. I don't know.
I think the claim is that the illusion is the I.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yes.
So, I mean, it's not like the illusion is being created for someone. The illusion is the someone.
Sure. Yeah, but illusions, they're experienced. Or illusions are for something. They're not just in a vacuum. They're I can't think of an example where you could create an illusion without someone to see or observe the illusion. But I obviously could be wrong. We don't know the answers to these questions.
Well, which sort of puts us in a pickle for the conversation, because everyone has to realize that when we say consciousness, you're kind of fudging that and pretending we actually know what we're talking about when we say consciousness, because without an actual definition and without specific criteria on which to measure it, it's sort of a fuzzy word.
Yeah, it's experiential and subjective. It's everything that scientists despise when they're trying to logically work through these problems. I totally get it. But I get it. But like, I think we all have this subjective experience, I think. And I think it's kind of foolish to just pretend like it doesn't exist, or just say it's like an illusion. I think the idea of a first person perspective, like I think you put in the email when we were getting ready to talk about this, I think that's a pretty reasonable way to conceptualize it. I mean, I hear people talk about consciousness like it's conscience, and I'm like, oh boy, now we're really in trouble. Like or that it's emotion or love, or or intelligence. People conflate intelligence and consciousness all the time. And it's like, no. I agree. We have to have some understanding of these words. So
Okay,
I guess this sort of sphere of perception that we render around ourselves, but not just the sensory input. It's the experience of the input, I think, is how I sort of think of consciousness.
Okay, so and I think in philosophy, and Dale can correct me if I get this wrong, but I think in philosophy they call that the experience qualia, what it is to be something. So I think if you want to use qualia, we can use that word. But so is in your mind, is consciousness and qualia basically synonymous words, or do you think, because you said that intelligence, emotions, that kind of thing don't constitute consciousness, it's just that that one specific experience, right?
Yeah, because I mean, I don't know that you would need to be conscious to be intelligent, at least by our definition. I mean, look at ChatGPT. I mean, you have a hard time convincing me that ChatGPT doesn't display some type of intelligence, right?
Or calculators.
Sure. Yeah, right. So intelligence can be kind of algorithmic. It's like a logical puzzle solving ability. It doesn't, but now if there's someone, again, and this could be an illusion, I guess, but it begs the question why, I think. But there's the experience of sort of observing your thought process and observing the logic and thinking it through and puzzling about it. It feels like it's more than algorithmic, and feels is such the wrong, but listen, we're talking about immeasurable things. So it feels like we're witnessing something, not just that we're algorithmically doing something. I mean, reflexes, pretty straightforward. And I even have a slide about reflexes. Just like, you hit the patellar tendon with the hammer, action potential goes into the spinal cord, doesn't even go to the brain. And it triggers a motor neuron to flex your quadriceps. That is algorithmic to me. That you could explain a lot of things by scaling algorithmic circuits like that. I mean, that's how computers work. Circuits scaled, thousands of circuits. So you could scale that up to, a complex math equation or intelligence, of general intelligence even. But it is the awareness, the perception of being in a passenger seat inside your body that I think is difficult to explain.
So do you think, from what I understand, is that you're
just butt in here for half a second as a host. Trevor, if you did want, because I think you mentioned something on one of your slides there. So when you want me to show it, just mention like, hey, Dale, I want to show the slides. And just a quick question for each of you before Darren continues. Would you both agree? So consciousness requires an experience and an experiencer. I think, are you guys agreeing on that much? Just before you
I think so.
I would say that I wouldn't say it like that. I would say that the experiencer and the experience are the same thing.
Okay, cool. So yeah, go ahead and continue there.
So Trevor, so you feel that the scientific explanations are untestable, which I tend to agree with you on that. And I understand that you're a substance dualist. Is that correct?
That's not a word I've ever used, but
you think there's the brain, and then you think there's another substance that holds the experience.
Well, this is where my feelings get kind of complicated. I think like on the more traditional religious side, there's like an insistence that divine things can't have any physical nature. Although there's obviously lots of debate about that. And then like on the extreme rational side, it's, everything is physical. And I think like increasingly we learn that maybe the categories might not be that clearly defined. I mean, that's why I'm so interested in, which I know very little about, what all these quantum physicists are up to. These crazy theoretical guys talking about these, entanglement and all these different things. It's interesting. It's like our definition of physical is inadequate, and so I don't really have like a clear cut, like, no, the brain absolutely, like, obviously the brain is incredibly important and, is deeply intrinsically tied to behavior and emotion and cognition and probably consciousness. My argument is that complexity, neuronal circuit complexity, which is basically the theory, like the integrated workflow and workspace theories, all these neuroscientific theories. It's basically that if you get enough complexity, consciousness emerges. And so this is like a spiritual term, arises, emerges, and it's not testable. And so am I a dualist? I don't know.
Well, I think it's testable. I mean, because electrons and protons make up an atom, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's a gold atom or a water atom or a plutonium atom or whatever it is. It's just electrons and protons, right? So, I mean, in that sense, wouldn't you say that the gold is sort of an emergent property of the electrons and protons?
No, you misunderstand. I'm not saying that emergent properties don't exist. I'm saying that consciousness is not one of them.
And how did you determine that consciousness was?
Well, it's kind of a category error, right? I mean, like if you look at like emergent properties people like to use are like a school of fish, for example. So like at some base sort of algorithmic idea, like, this fish is going to stay 2 inches to the left of this neighbor and 2 inches to the left of this neighbor, right? It's a very basic sort of foundational principle. We're going to get these cool like geometric patterns of schooling fish, or same with the snowflake, like some principle of the way water freezes is going to result in all these complex designs that you would have never guessed, like based on that first geometric principle. But the outcome is of the same type as the foundational principle. Like, in this case of the schooling fish, like you get a geometric outcome from a geometric principle, right? And so when we get to consciousness, we throw common sense out the window and we say, no. If you get enough circuits, you get a subjective experience of being inside of a body. And it's like, there's no mechanistic way to scale that up from circuits. Neurons are pretty cool. Don't get me wrong. I'm fascinated by them. I mean, you basically have an analog sensor, which are the dendrites in the cell body, that is converted to a digital signal at the axon hillock. So they're incredible little machines. And so you can create circuits, you can create little reflexes, you can make incredibly complex parallel processing. That explains everything to me, but subjective experience. And so I don't get how you make that claim, other than it's just really convenient. It's just a really convenient way to
I guess I don't understand your reluctance to, or your initial thought that they're two different things. Because, I mean, for example, a computer, we're all looking at computers, right?
Mhm.
At its fundamental base, what we're looking at is zeros and ones, right?
Mhm.
And yet I can see you, your hat, your shirt, your little microphone thing there.
Yeah.
And I mean, how is that different than getting an experience from zeros and ones and getting, entire worlds in online games and, things that we can move around and talking to each other and all that? What's this fundamental difference that you're seeing that I'm not?
Well, I mean, like for the example of like displaying an image, you can, with some knowledge of computer programming and the way computers work, you can reduce that to zeros and ones systematically and
Right,
mechanistically. You
but
can
that's a
create.
difference in knowledge, not a difference in capability, right?
Sure. So you can scale, well, sort of. You can say, okay, if I create this pixel map, and I have this sensor map from my camera, I can map pixel intensities and an RGB color scheme, and I can create an image. Now, I don't think you would suggest that the computer is conscious of that image, and that's because that's just a fundamentally different thing.
Well, not
Uh,
yet, but
well,
artificial intelligence is getting there, right?
okay. Well, I think this is an interesting point. This is where I get in the most trouble. So you do think that will create conscious machines?
I don't think there's anything in the physics that will stop it. And I
Okay.
think that because right now LLMs, they have no memory, and they're working the exact same way our brains are because we developed them to work exactly like our brains do. And so if we give it all the capabilities that our brains have, I have no reason to think that it would act differently than how our brains do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would certainly emulate consciousness perfectly. I just think it's interesting that you believe conscious machines can be created. We're just not one of them.
No, I think we're conscious machines.
Okay.
I think we were created by natural selection and chemistry.
Okay. I think that's a loose word of the word, a loose use of the word created. Because I don't know if AI would emerge on its own, but maybe given enough time.
Well, I think that's what we are.
Yeah, but I think that's an interesting perspective.
AI that emerged naturally, and we just call AI because it's on a computer, and we're the original. So obviously, we're not artificial. So,
well, it's funny. It's funny how much we agree. I don't arrive at your original conclusion. Because I tend to think like observation in the absence of an ability to test a scientific hypothesis, observation is useful. And so I've only been witness to one, if we even can create conscious machines, which I don't think we could, but say we did, I've only would have ever been present at the birth of one conscious machine, and it would have been created by, design. So I just think that's interesting. I think in the absence of being able to test the hypothesis, I just think it's cool to see, the observation. Yeah.
well, I mean, so if your criteria, and correct me if I'm mischaracterizing you here, but from what I can tell, your dubiousness about the prospect is because science can't currently explain how you get from the neuron to consciousness, and for whatever reason you believe that it's an unpassable gulf between the consciousness and the neurons. So how do you fix that in
Well,
your
I
mind?
I think we just would need to be a little bit more open-minded to other explanations for conscious experience. They
And
could be,
how are
it
you
could be
defining
physical.
how are you defining
Sorry.
explanation?
Just anything that would explain conscious experience.
So
So like
any story, like if I said fairies exist in our brain, and would that be count as an explanation? And
that's kind of a silly thing to say.
well, it's silly on purpose because I'm
Okay.
trying to figure out where your boundaries are.
Well, no. I mean, within a scientific framework. So I actually think that the current scientific explanations are very similar to the fairies in our brain idea. So it's funny that you use that analogy, because I feel like that's kind of what we're doing currently, is we're saying like, hey, if you connect things together in a complicated enough way, magic,
Right?
and
No, I
oh,
get that.
sorry.
I'm just trying to figure out what do you describe as an explanation?
Oh, well, I don't know if we have a good one, but I like falsifiable explanations. I mean, I like, I enjoy this microtubule stuff. I know they get some flack and some stuff, but I like that it's falsifiable. I like that you can test things. Um, for example, uh, you guys are familiar with them when I say microtubule stuff, what I'm talking about.
I am, yeah.
Okay, so it's it's probably an incorrect idea. Just this idea that there's something special about these microtubules, which are like a highly evolutionary conserved structure. They're present in all cells, plants, animals, etc. And so they're especially complex in the cortical neurons of the brain. And we kind of just think traditionally that they're just sort of like part of the cell skeleton. They're tubes. And there's these amazing videos on YouTube. You can watch these little motor proteins that walk on them, and they drag a vesicle filled with neurotransmitters. Super cool. But there's this idea that maybe there's some kind of special properties about these structures, and it would really be a silly idea if it wasn't for the fact that you can perform experiments on these structures, and they're testable. And so, one example of how you might falsify the idea that microtubules are central to consciousness. I should back up. The reason why this is interesting is it was a physicist who originally kind of came up with this idea that there's something about, and this starts to get just really abstract and crazy really quick, but there's something about waveform collapse, the collapse of an electron or a proton or whatever particle from just existing in like a probability cloud to a discrete location. There's something about that he thought would be central to consciousness. It's very vague, very abstract. And this anesthesiologist came along with some ideas about microtubules, that they may contain that basically entangled photons, because their diameter is about the right size to do so, and that they might interact with light in interesting ways. These would all be crazy ideas, like a fairy, except you can test it. I mean, that's kind of the fundamental distinction. This is why I don't really
But wouldn't
love.
that be a physical way the brain
Yeah. Oh,
is able to
absolutely.
create
Absolutely.
consciousness?
But let me ask you a question. Two photons entangled on opposite sides of the universe, you know, is that physical? I would say yes,
Yeah.
actually. I mean, I think so.
Yeah.
But
I mean, if
sorry.
you're taking quantum physics seriously, then yeah, it would be physical.
Yeah, right. So, but isn't that kind of a mechanism for, I think back to our guys existing in their little computer, and trying to study. I mean, it'd be impossible for them to study the hard drive they're on, right? But if they did come up with some mechanism, like it's almost like our beings are being rendered from somewhere, I mean, and they could test that and show that, and it's like, okay, yeah, I guess that's physical, but I don't think that maybe means what you think it means. I just think that maybe means there's a good explanation for this that's non-local, maybe.
Okay,
I don't know. I just like
okay,
that it's testable, but I'll point to some of those tests, but go ahead.
yeah, no, that's fine. So I was making an assumption here, then maybe that's, and I realized that I'm not sure if we got sidetracked or if I just didn't give you a chance to answer. But so what is, so you're not a substance dualism. You don't think that there's a physical and then there's some other substance that controls the physical? I mean, are you open to a physical understanding of consciousness? It's just not the current theories, or
I'm
are you?
I'm open to a physical explanation of consciousness, but I think inherent in some of these newer testable ideas is like a non-locality
And
to
what do
that.
you mean by non-locality?
Well, I mean, again, now we're just getting into belief and speculation, but that's okay. I'll go there since you asked. But that let's say there is a quantum explanation for consciousness.
Hmm.
That kind of implies that there is some signal somewhere.
Hmm.
This is the guy who invented the CPU. He's an interesting character. I forget his name. It's Federico something. Apologies, but he kind of has this idea that the quality of the conscious experience is sort of like a drone, right? And so there's a signal to the drone. Kind of I love listening to quantum physicists talk about this, because they say like it's almost like something in my brain is tapping into the quantum field, and like that's where consciousness comes from. I'm like, man, that sure sounds a lot like a soul, But and so I'm open to it. In fact, I believe it's non-local. Now, I don't know if I would make a strong scientific case for that, but that would be what I'd say my belief is.
Right, but I guess my question is, what do you mean by non-local?
Not
What's the definition?
not in your brain. Not
Uh, okay, so you think it's
not entirely, at least. It's interacting with something. I mean, the religious explanation for this is the flesh is animated by the spirit, but we're kind of having trying to have a more scientific discussion. So
right. So
What? Okay, Darren, I'll let
go
you
ahead,
ask
Dale.
the question.
Go ahead.
Well, I was. I think this might be a good point to kind of like, what exactly does the neuroscience itself prove? Like, what are the limits? Because obviously, speaking as a philosopher, just to help categorize here, like, it's clear that Trevor, in terms of the brain, he might posit some sort of correlation or even a causation relationship between consciousness and the physical hardware of the brain. Whereas Darren, I know from our previous studies, you say no, it's an identity relation. The brain is the consciousness kind of thing, right?
Well, the mind is what the brain does. Like digestion is what the stomach does.
Okay, so but basically, your consciousness, you are identical to your brain. Would that be true on your view, or well,
I think
let
in
me
any
not.
practical understanding of the words, yeah.
Okay, so why don't we discuss that? Does the neuroscience actually help us to determine which of these views would be correct? I'll let you guys discuss that for a bit.
I mean, as far as any practical way of studying this, I would say, yeah, probably. But I don't know if consciousness is really a practical thing. It's an experience that we all have. I'm not sure. Again, it's not testable, it's not falsifiable. Now, that said, as far as like what does the neuroscience prove about consciousness? In my view, nothing. And again, I come from a more clinical perspective. I'm probably not as versed in all the theory building and stuff that goes on in sort of this philosophical science that is kind of the neuroscience of consciousness. But in my view, it doesn't really prove much. And so much of our understanding of the brain, it might be, maybe this would be a good time to look at the slides a little bit. I think it's useful to know like the fundamental, what neurons do, and then just how do we scale that up to subjective experience? And maybe we can. It's just not obvious. Oh, thank you. Thank you. You have it. I'm echoing now for some reason. Do you guys?
And would it be fair to say that the consensus of the field is that everything is physical, and that
yeah, definitely. That's actually one of the core tenets, I would say, is physicalism. It's funny. It's almost like whoever came up with the like ontological commitments of integrated information theory was like specifically trying to rule out quantumness, because the wording they use is almost like tailor custom made to rule that out. But yes, definitely that is the consensus view. Absolutely. Oh, okay. Anyway, so really what I'm interested in really as a hobby, this is not what I do for work. Obviously there's some crossover, but I'm interested in this idea. What I would say is kind of the core claim of the neuroscience of consciousness, folks, is that it is an emergent property or a byproduct of network complexity. And listen, the brain is insanely complex, so it's a good thing to hang your hat on, right? Because it's one of these things where complexity never ends. In fact, it's so much more complex than I think we even realize. We sort of have this what's called neuron dogma, which is that the neuron is everything about the brain, but the neurons are outnumbered 10 to 1 by other cells. And some of those cells, I'm just talking about in the brain, not the body. Some of those cells, like astrocytes, are also capable of neurotransmission. It's called gliotransmission. We've barely even started studying that. So to just kind of say, like, the brain is incredibly complex, and I'm sure the answer is in there somewhere. I get it. It's totally reasonable. It's totally compelling. It's, again, though, it's kind of like an untestable claim. But so real quick, just to talk about what the neuron does, I think what happens is we stack layers of simplicity, and then we get to this incredibly complex theory, and it's just overwhelming to people. They're like, well, obviously consciousness is in there somewhere. But I think if we try to, like, go to what the neuron does, listen, I don't know if I'll change anybody's mind here. I'm just sharing my belief. So the yellow end of this neuron, this is called the dendrites in the cell body. This is like a sensor. It collects chemical signals from other axons, other neurons. It could have upwards of 10,000 inputs. And so the network complexity scales really fast. And so those interactions between what's called the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, they summate inside the cell body. So some impulses might be positive. They might raise the electrical signal inside the neuron. Some might be negative or inhibitory. And so all of these signals coalesce. Really, the analogy for this is an analog signal, because the farther away the input is, the weaker it is. It's like dropping a pebble in a pond. And they mix. They're positive, they're negative, they're big, they're small. If you see that funnel, there's a little arrow called the axon hillock. That is like the critical, this often called the trigger zone, because those signals coalesce there. At rest, the neuron's about negative 70 millivolts. So it's more negative inside than outside. If it hits negative 55, it triggers something called an action potential. And that's like the fundamental signal of a neuron. An action potential, it shoots down the axon, goes to the axon terminals, and chemicals are released on the next neuron in the chain. And so this is what a neuron does. It integrates analog signal. There's a threshold value. It's very much like a large language model. There's parameters and thresholds and things. And then a signal is produced, and then it shoots down the axon terminal and triggers some new cascade of events. And so we can go to the next slide. I can stop. I don't know if there's anything. Okay, we'll just keep going. And so this is just an example of how incoming signals would summate over time or space. And so you could get excitatory signals from multiple sources, like in the first panel here, but they're spaced too far apart in time. So there's no summation and no signal is produced. So you can imagine, like, if you touch a warm stove, you're not going to trigger a threshold in your pain receptors. You're going to trigger threshold in your temperature receptors. You'll feel the heat, but you're not going to trigger those in the pain receptors. So you won't feel pain. The next slide, it's the same two signals. So now maybe we increase the temperature a bit. I'm sorry, I said next slide. Go back. The next panel there. If you get the excitatory inputs closer together in time, you get signal produced and you would feel pain. And then you can have inhibitory and excitatory signals commingling. It gets very complicated. Next slide. This I don't know if this is interesting. Hopefully it is to folks. I don't know. I
find it interesting. I just think your summation is pretty much applicable to all of life. It's complicated.
Yeah, it is very complicated. And so anyway, I think my more philosophical view is that sometimes scientists like to couch their theories in the complicated nature of this stuff, because who's going to question them, right? But anyway, so this is just another way that this shows if we're going from an analog signal to a binary signal, we need a way to code stimulus. And so the way the neuron codes stimulus is by the frequency of action potential generation. So we'll go back to temperature sensing now. If you touch something, kind of maybe the exact same temperature as your skin, that might be a subthreshold stimulus, so no action potentials are produced. If you touch something lukewarm, you might send 4 action potentials, as that's what's shown here in the slide, that go to your brain. That registers as warm. But if you touch something hot, you might send 20 action potentials over, a similar period of time. And then your brain would interpret that as a stronger signal. Okay, now I'll go to the next slide. So really, reflexes, we talk about reflexes like they're fundamentally distinct, but really that's all neurons are just circuits. Neurons are circuits, and reflexes are just ones that we're not consciously aware of. And so here, these are some examples of some reflexes. I don't know if this is interesting. I love this reflex. It's called the vestibulo-ocular reflex. And so it's just stuff blows my mind. So you have these semicircular canals on either side of your head and your inner ear, and they're arranged in different planes. And so they're filled with fluid, and you have hairs that are connected to neurons growing into the fluid. And then on the end of each hair is a little crystalline rock. And so that rock is neutrally buoyant in the fluid. And so if you picture like a cup of ice and you turn the cup, right, the water stays stationary. The ice stays stationary as the cup moves. So if that happens, it would bend the hairs. And so that creates action potentials. And that's where equilibrium comes from. That's how you tell your position in space, what direction you're moving with your eyes closed. And you have a reflex that's designed to keep your eyes steady while your head moves. It's why you can look at your finger and go like this, and your finger isn't blurry. And this is that reflex. And it's actually very simple. If you look at it one step at a time, I mean, we don't necessarily need to do it, but it's basically like, okay, this neuron triggers that neuron. This neuron triggers the muscle on the left, this neuron triggers that neuron, this trigger. Anyway, so these reflexes are pretty straightforward. And basically what the brain is just a tremendously scaled up version of circuitry like this. And so my argument would be is there's just not some inherent emergent phenomenon of consciousness that occurs when you scale up complexity. And I mean, I think there's lots of smarter people than me who will tell me I'm wrong, but I don't think there's like a very compelling mechanistic chain of events that would convince me otherwise.
So what do you think of all the experiments and results and everything that show that when you modify the brain, you modify a person's experience?
Yeah. Well, this has always struck me as like a strange argument because I would never argue that the brain is not like a fundamental part of who you are. So yeah, I even think that the seat of consciousness might or probably is located in the brain. And so, yeah, if you take half of your brain out, your subjective experience of reality is going to change dramatically. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's interesting, maybe like more nuanced arguments probably that would make me pause more, give me more thought. But
I guess I'm a little confused then. So you don't think the brain is capable of producing?
I don't think neuronal complexity is capable of producing conscious phenomenon. Yeah.
Okay, and you're distinguishing. Okay, because I was assuming that those, like the brain and neuron activity would be synonymous, but you don't see it that way?
Well, listen, I mean, the brain is obviously, it's a big clump of neurons. But no, all I'm saying is I don't think neuronal complexity explains it. So if there was some brave scientists out there that wanted to challenge neuron dogma and say, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, I'd be very interested in hearing that. There are some. They get kind of like berated, unfortunately, but there are some. They get beat up pretty bad. But I think that stuff is interesting. And again, if you'll permit me to go back to this microtubule thing for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, tomorrow it could come out that the whole microtubule thing is completely garbage, and there could be some fundamental study that proves it beyond any reasonable doubt. And I'd say, okay, I'm not like married to any of these ideas. But one thing that is cool about the microtubule is it is a testable structure. Now, there are problems with it still. I still think it's difficult for us as humans to understand how this physical structure can yield this like subjective experience. But I think the evidence is actually a little bit better because, one of the interesting things and why it's interesting that an anesthesiologist came up with the idea is that, and he's an atheist, by the way, is that we don't really know how anesthesia works. and if your neighbor's an anesthesiologist, he's not going to tell you that if you go ask him. But if you read any systematic review of anesthesia, there's going to be explanations of how it works. But what you're going to find, it's like they all work a little bit differently. Like some modify GABA receptors, some modify chloride ions, some do this, some do that. And for a class of drugs that has like almost like a universally similar effect, which is to turn off conscious experience, you would expect the mechanism to be a little bit more similar among these different drugs. And so there is a group of anesthesiologists and researchers who are concerned by this problem. Not all of them, obviously. I'd say a minority are concerned by this problem. So one of these guys in particular, I forget the exact circumstances that led to him coming up with this idea, but he was convinced that microtubules were important. It's actually interesting too, because a lot of neuropsychiatric disorders, like the primary marker of disease is a microtubule protein. Like Alzheimer's, for example, is tau, and that's a microtubule stabilizer. Same with schizophrenia, same with all these like consciousness disorders, the microtubules seem to be implicated, which is interesting. And so he said, well, we should be able to test that. That's what's cool. It becomes falsifiable, right? If we can show that anesthesia does not interact with microtubules, then boom, it's falsified. That's a scientific hypothesis, right? I like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I understand that your main contention with the current state of neurology is the unfalsifiability of the hypothesis.
Yeah, just a specific narrow sector of neuroscience, which is this like neuroscience of consciousness stuff, not neurology. But
yeah, that's what I meant. Sorry.
Yeah.
So, and my general thought is that the mind is what the brain does, whether that's through microtubules or information theory or the global network theory or the higher order, whatever the ultimate idea ends up being shown to be true. My guess is that whatever it is, it's going to be that the mind is what the brain does. Do you disagree with that assessment, or do you think that there's something else going on that's affecting the brain? Because you said it was non-local. Is there something like outside the brain that you think is testable that would dethrone some of these ideas? Or
as far as I know, with our current technology, unless we got really good at like measuring quantum signals, which I don't believe we can, then I would say no. I would say ultimately, unfortunately, at some time we're going to get to a point where we just cannot continue to test these ideas, because like the guys in the video game, they cannot explain the RAM that their brains are working in, right?
Right. No, I wasn't really talking about the testability of the theories. I was trying to put that to the side. But all these ideas, even the microtubule ones, sounds like it's all the mind is what the brain does.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. So, I mean, I think one of the things that's unique about the microtubules, and again, I don't really understand this stuff. I'm not convinced that anybody does, but one of the things that's unique is that the microtubules themselves, it's not really clear cut how they would create consciousness because they're not networked, right? The neurons are networked. The microtubules aren't. They're contained within the neurons, and they're present in every cell, right? And this kind of begs the question, like, how does a protozoa have memory? They can display some like basic things. They won't return to a area where a chemical was that's hazardous or something, right? And it's like, well, they have microtubules, so that's interesting. Maybe these microtubules are involved. The question is like, how? And so the interesting part of this research is that they seem to interact with light. And what I mean by that is anesthesia gas affects the luminescence of microtubules. And this is outside of I really am just like grasping at straws here. Someone else can get a quantum physicist on here who's into this, but microtubules seem to interact with light. They interact with anesthetic gas in a very interesting way, in a way that anesthesia stops working on mice if you supply them with a microtubule binding agent drug first. So to me, they're clearly implicated. And so if they interact with light, if they have quantum properties, whatever that means, it seems to open the door for like a non-local explanation. That's all I'm saying. I mean, that's wild. It's speculation. I don't know. But what I find interesting is like we have scientists starting to put forward a non-local explanation of consciousness. And to me, that's because the current explanations aren't adequate. But
And do you think that non-local means is identical to non-physical, or are you using those synonymously, or is it not? Can non-local also be physical?
I don't know. Honestly, I'm not sure. Yeah, that's the only reasonable answer I think I could give you.
And just let me know when you want me to go back to the slides there.
Oh yeah, I feel like
unless you were done with the phone.
Yeah. Well, let me just wrap. There's like kind of a conclusion. So let me just quickly end the spiel, if you guys don't mind. A lot of, and it'd be unfair to say all, but we can go to the next slide. A lot of what we understand about like what regions of the brain do what and how the brain works is based on fMRI. And I work with fMRI a lot. It's an amazing technology. It is kind of mysterious. Like we don't really know if bold signal, that's the signal you measure in fMRI, is related to neuronal activity. We're pretty confident it is, though, to be fair. Basically, what we're measuring is the magnetic properties of the brain. And so the hemoglobin molecule has 4 iron atoms in it. And so the amount of oxygen it carries, iron rusts, right? So you can oxidize these 4 iron atoms, and there can be 4 oxygen molecules in this hemoglobin molecule when it's fully oxidized. Its magnetic properties will be different with 4 oxygens compared to 1 or 2 or 3. So we can kind of get a sense of how much oxygen is present in a brain region based on this magnetic signal. So we can go to the next slide. And so using that, but then also using like postmortem stroke analyses and stuff, we've kind of mapped what regions of the brain do what. And it's very interesting. And obviously people spend their lives studying this stuff. I'm fascinated by it. We go to the next slide. But let's just go one more. Let's finish it up. Here is where we get this integrated information theory, which is one of the theories. I read them. They all kind of sound sort of similar. This seems to be like the most popular one. Again, in full transparency, this sort of like philosophical neuroscience is not really my area of expertise, but sort of their ontological commitments are realism. The world exists independently of experience, physicalism, cause and effect, and atomism. You can kind of, they mean something a little bit different than like what Newton meant when he talked about atomism or something, but that causal relationships can be reduced to interactions between minimal units. This is interesting because it's like they were sitting down, whoever wrote this, it's like they were sitting down with like a fringe quantum physicist, and they're like, how do we keep you from getting in our business? Like how do we keep you out of this theory? Well, first he'd be like, well, first you say that the world exists independently of experience, right? Because they don't believe that, or certain physicists don't believe that. And then you say there's clear physicalism and cause and effect. So anyway, it's just kind of funny, but ultimately the theory is that this conscious experience or whatever you want to call it is an emergent property of network complexity. And I'm always suspicious of these words like emerges and arises in scientific theories. I know there's such a thing as emergent properties. It just feels, I don't know. It feels like not lazy thinking, but it just feels like we don't really have an explanation. And I wish they would just say that. But anyway, let's go to the next slide. And this is my last, one more. We already talked about this. This is my last slide. And we've talked about most of this too, but I do think you can't falsify it. There is no experiment you can devise that would say, oh, yep, you're right. And that's because we haven't really laid out a mechanism. Like you need a specific mechanism to falsify. And, we talked about category error, but something that I think is important is this correlation versus causation idea. And, people who've sat through a stats class have seen this graph. Ice cream sales and shark attacks are highly correlated in time, but there's no causal relationship. It's just that people tend to buy ice cream and people tend to swim in the ocean in July and August, right? And so this is kind of what we're doing with when we study the brain with fMRI or even postmortem stroke analysis, is we're saying like, hey, this part of your brain consumes more oxygen when we ask you to recall a visual memory. Therefore, visual memories are stored here or generated here, right? And that, I mean, that is possible. I'm very much open to that. I just think that's a belief, where it's a correlation versus causation. It's non-falsifiable. It could just as easily be something else. It could be, again, some type of non-local explanation where that part of the brain is interacting with some non-local signal, kind of like an old mystic kind of Tesla idea. Like, I haven't penetrated it, but somewhere out there in the universe is the source of, consciousness or whatever. I don't know. My point is just that these are beliefs. And I think it's kind of like disingenuous to frame the argument as we've got the naive believers versus the hyper rational empiricists. I think we're all kind of believers. So anyway, when it comes to these issues, these questions, now when it comes to like studying weather, that's a different thing. I think you can be empirical and rational, but for these types of core foundational questions, I think we're all believers.
So if you think that the correlation causation thing is an issue, what do you think of the experiments that show when you change the brain, you change the experience that arises? Well, what they would call arises from the brain. You don't think that's a direct cause? Doesn't directly demonstrate causation?
Well, let me ask you a question. So if I inject your hippocampus with some toxin, right?
Uh-huh.
And it
you give me some good drugs.
You lose all your memory, right?
Uh-huh.
Obviously, I see your point there. Like, oh, well, that's where my memory is. But you could just as easily say, well, that's the area that receives my memories. I mean, it's like if you cut the antenna off a radio, did the antenna produce the music or was it a receiver for the music? Well, we know it's a receiver for the music. And
right,
so, yeah.
But do we have any real reason to think that the brain is a receiver? I mean, sure. I mean, it's like logically possible in the idea that there's no direct contradiction, P and not P. But I mean, what's the mechanism? I mean,
well,
if you are criticizing the science for not having a mechanism.
Well, no, you're making my point though. I think they're all beliefs. That's what I'm saying. I think they're all beliefs. I think what I'm saying is a belief, and I think what they're saying is a belief. Now, I don't think we.
But do you think? But I guess my question is, okay, so if we accept that it's a receiver, but if the brain is a receiver and we damage the brain and we no longer have the experience, does that mean that the brain is still creating the experience?
It's receiving it. I mean, I don't know. I again, like how could I know? This is like an impossible question.
But you don't see any indication of causation when you damage the brain and the experience changes.
I see that there's clearly a role for the brain in conscious experience. I don't see evidence that the brain is the generator. It may be, I don't know. But in terms of conscious experience, I don't think there is, certainly not empirical evidence that it generates conscious experience. Like obviously, yeah. So I don't know. Now it's correlated with all sorts of things. And I think the brain obviously does very important things. The brain might do everything even, but it's not complex neural network. I mean, I think we have this like desire to conceptualize of ourselves as computers. And it makes sense. Like that's our current amazing technology. And, we used to conceptualize of the brain as like a clock, like, in the pre-industrial age and stuff. And, with gears and things, it's just, I think we just have this desire to make it all about circuitry. And I don't think we have evidence for that.
Yeah. And okay. So putting that aside, do you at least understand why the consensus in the neurology is that the changing the brain, changing the experience actually indicates causation?
Not until you said that last sentence. I mean, I understand the consensus. Like if you kind of have like a priori assumption that it has to be local because there is no such thing as like non-local phenomena, right?
Well, I think they're going on. I don't think it's a priori because of that. I think it's a priori because of the thousands of years of supernatural causation showing to be not real things.
Are you saying quantum physics is supernatural? Now we're talking. Now you're speaking my language.
Well, no, I'm thinking of your non-local, because when you say non-local, the philosophers and the theists in the audience are thinking supernatural.
Okay. Yeah.
And
I could see
that's
it.
why I say it like that, not
But I
because
mean,
I.
what is the difference really? I think we tie meaning up into words and stuff. So it gets complicated to have like these kinds of discussions. But I mean, I'm not really sure I understand the difference, so
Well, I mean, because
Okay.
if you're saying that it's a quantum non-local, then quantum is physical. So you're saying it's a physical non-local,
it
whatever
could
it
be.
is.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
could be. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question that's relevant to this part, the correlation versus causation? And I loved your analogy. That was kind of what I was asking, because there is that third thing where Darren's going even further. Like some theists, Christian theists, even myself, I'm happy to grant maybe there is a causation thing. Again, you might Trevor would argue, but that's not proven. That's a belief at that level. Fine, but let's say it is proven that there is a causation relation. I would probably agree with Darren on that. But that rules out Darren's notion that it's identical. That's what physicalism requires, is that
No,
it
I
isn't
disagree
an
completely with that.
antenna that
Yeah.
zaps signals to my consciousness and creates a pain, and vice versa. It is that antenna. My consciousness is identical to the thing. So I just wanted to point that out. Like for you guys, there's the correlation relation, there's the causation relation, and the identity relation. That which of these three is it, kind of thing. And yeah, the neuroscience can't prove it, is what I'm understanding. But for you, Darren, like, would you say no? We can say it's proven. Like, are you arguing for causation or identity? What's your
Well, I think Trevor would agree that the consensus in the field is that it's been proven that the mind is what the brain does. They may argue about how it does it, and they don't know the specifics of how it does it. But I think he would agree that the consensus in the field is that the mind is what the brain does.
Yeah, I would say that's the consensus, just like the Christian consensus is that God created the universe. I just think it's a belief. Yeah. So, but yes, I agree.
All right, cool. I just wanted to clarify that. So yeah, do you want to finish off the rest of the points on that, or on the slide, Trevor? Or?
Oh, sure. I don't even remember where we were.
Yeah, I think we left off on correlation, causation.
Yeah, ice cream and sharks.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, now from here we get into more of like kind of just things that I think are interesting. Again, I don't really think these are like scientific claims, but I don't know. And so, there is kind of this question, like if the structure of the neuronal circuits is where consciousness comes from, then why does consciousness vary so much? Now, I think there's probably plenty of explanations for that, but they kind of like contradict the theory in a way. So I just think it depends like how charitable you want to be with the theory. And I think it's reasonable to be, charitable. This is very complicated, but there's all these examples of paradoxical lucidity, like someone is nonverbal and can't speak for 10 years. And then before they pass away, all of a sudden they're just crystal clear. It's just like, I think there's like a New England Journal of Medicine paper that says some ridiculous number, like 80% of dementia patients whose last moments are observed display some type of paradoxical lucidity. I don't make a ton of that, but it does beg the question, like, well, neuronal circuitry doesn't change very quickly, and it certainly doesn't get more. It doesn't get better at the end of life, certainly. But I think there's other maybe endocrine explanations or something that could account for that. So, and then there's this question of observer permanence. I think this is interesting. Again, I don't think any of these are like silver bullets, but our cells turn over as we age. Now, technically, though, our neurons don't. Our neurons have incredible longevity. They're with us from the beginning until the end. They can live maybe 100 years, right? That's kind of the upper limit of our lifespan, actually, is the fact that our neurons sort of have this lifespan. And they don't change that much. So you could say, well, like if the neurons are there the whole time, that makes sense. But the thing is, the circuitry isn't. The circuitry changes a lot. The networks change dramatically throughout your life, but your first person perspective doesn't really change. So like if the conscious, what's that?
You don't think so?
I don't.
I know that I perceive the world a lot different than when I was like 7.
Like, but philosophically, or like, do you actually feel like you're no longer in your head? Like you feel like you're third person, or like, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, because no longer feeling like you're in your head, that's not going to change just because the circuitry changed, because you have to assume that there's only one way to do it in order to make that argument. And
Well,
that's
I mean, I
I've
guess yeah, it depends how you define consciousness, right? Like that goes back to your very first question. I think that's like the real question, you know?
yeah,
Because
and
yeah,
I
if you oh, go ahead. Sorry.
and there are drugs that you can take where you no longer feel like you're inside your body. So, I mean,
Yeah,
and that's a
but
chemical change to the brain.
doesn't that prove the point that it doesn't come from the neuronal circuits? It comes from some other mechanism. And what's
I don't know
interesting
how
is
it
like
could. I don't know how it could prove that,
it's like
because
psychedelic.
if you're adding, if the brain works on chemicals and you add chemicals in the brain and it changes your perspective, that seems like a direct A to B to C to me. I don't know how that would indicate some sort of anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to kind of modify the theory, which seems reasonable, that it's like it's not just the complexity of the neuronal interaction, it's the complexity plus, you know, the interaction of certain chemicals at certain synapses, you know, and yeah, just like kind of more like a more kind of like robust, less like axiomatic explanation of the theory. But
Well, I think
what's
that's
the
all included in like the IIT and the GNWT and all that. I think that's
yeah, but I
all
mean, there's a
included.
difference between saying like neuronal activity changes and then scaling up and saying like here's the mechanism. You know, I mean, one thing that I do think is interesting is some of these psychedelic drugs and things interact with microtubules. But that said, I have seen some studies that show like mice brains on psychedelics. There's some electrical activity. It kind of looks like a sleeping mouse while they're awake. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, my
Uh,
favorite mouse study is the one where they watch the memory neuron grow when they learn how to do a maze.
yeah.
They isolate that neuron, and they so that it doesn't interact with anything around it. The mouse can no longer interact with the maze. It's completely forgotten how to get from one end to the other, and then
Yeah.
they undo that interaction, and it can find its way again. I think that's so
Yeah.
cool.
And I think there's an absolute causal explanation for memory. Now the question is your subjective experience of memory, where does that come from? And this is like the thing that people it's a point people don't want to talk about because there's not like a clear-cut explanation, and I totally understand it, but I do think we have to contend with that. I mean, that's sort of what I mean by observer permanence is like your perception of being in your body and experiencing the world, it doesn't change despite your brain changing dramatically. Now your philosophy changes, your emotional regulation changes, your intelligence changes, your cognition changes, your memory changes, everything changes, but there's this perspective that you have doesn't change. And since that's kind of
Except
how
when
I
you take
define,
drugs.
yeah, except for when you take drugs, which I think is interesting. Yeah. Because some of these drugs do interact with you know microtubules, which I think is a cool idea. But
What? Why is that, Darren? Like the endure. You know, I use it as the enduring self type argument, but like it, if there is this substantive change, I understood it to occur every 8 years or something, but I think you guys are saying maybe that's false. But there is like substantive changes, but I think even you would admit like that 7 year old boy, you're very different, but that was you back when you were 7 years old. That subject subjective experience or I that there is that
Well,
sense of
well, it's
yeah.
because the specific ways that the brain is wired changes, but the overall way your brain is wired doesn't change. I think that's the difference.
Okay,
yeah, maybe.
fair enough, fair enough.
And
Yeah.
it's like if you're, because I know what argument you're sort of proposing there, and it's sort of like if you change out a steel axle on a car with a wood axle on a car. I mean assuming the wood is strong enough to support the weight, the car is still going to go. It's because the axle performs a function, and so you can change out that axle with something else all you want. It's the function still happens.
So what? So yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I like this stuff. Like, I agree. I mean, these are like interesting challenges. It's interesting to think about, but ultimately, I do think like we're all just kind of speculating in a way. I mean, I don't think we really cross the boundary of like a mechanistic explanatory theory with any of these ideas when we talk about consciousness scientifically. But,
Yeah, well, I mean, no one has.
Right.
Philosopher, theologists,
Yep.
scientists, but you know, the field's only been active for like 50 years, so at least scientifically.
Well, I do have another question before we get onto the panpsychism, because it's sort of related. So another similar thing is in terms of the art, the experience itself. There is arguments made by people in Eric LaRocque and stuff like that, where there is this single unified field of consciousness, right? Whereas if we are identical to the brain, our experience would be atomistic. It would be broken up because there are certain systems which aren't connected to each other in the brain. Um, do you think that's an argument, like Trevor and Darren? What do you think of that as an argument that consciousness isn't just it isn't just processes in the brain?
I think TVs disprove that because TVs are atomistic. In fact, the monitor you're watching is atomistic, and we perceive it as a
You're saying
continuous flow.
TV, like television?
Yeah, TV, the monitor you're looking at.
Okay.
It's all atomistic, and yet we perceive it as a persistent experience.
Okay. Trevor?
Yeah, no, that both ideas sound interesting to me. I don't know. I mean, I think it's also possible that this experience of consciousness does come from a specific part of your brain. So like if we're saying that, and again, it's a belief. I'm not speaking as a scientist right now. If we say that, we have these, I forget the word. They're tubulin dimers, these microtubules, but there's a name for them. Anyway, they're basically qubits, like a quantum computer, because they can take any orientation, but they're dipoles. They have a positive and a negative side, right? And so if we're saying that collectively, all of these qubits are entangled with some source, right? And this is sort of like an analog for the animating spark or the soul. This is why, who knows? This is complete bananas. But that's coming from a physical part of your brain. So yeah, I don't have like this like repulsion to physicalism that I think a lot of believers do. I wouldn't expect a passage in the gospel to say, and then the quantum qubits became entangled with the source and animated the flesh. Like this is not.
But how cool would it have been had it done that?
That'd be awesome. Yeah,
I would be a Christian right now if that was in the Bible.
But that thing, no. Everyone would have said, "What is this?" Like they never.
Exactly.
No yeah.
That's the whole point. No one would have had known until the 21st century.
Yeah. It would have been a good proof. You're right. It would have been a good proof. Yeah. So anyway, that's sort of how I can think of questions like that. It's not like a great answer. I mean, I think if you're looking, I think a lot of the debate around these ideas comes from the fact that we just all want an answer so bad. And I think it leads to kind of like predetermined conclusions, and you kind of fit the results to suit your theory. I mean, the great example, some of like the free will experiments, like the Libet experiments and stuff. These are like great examples of just over interpreting things and just kind of, I know what the truth is, so let me go conduct an experiment and fit my results to match. So I don't know. So
yeah, I don't think that's how those experiments work. I think that they were expecting the free will to begin with. Yeah. Although I'm not entirely sure if free will is philosophically sound, but
yeah, I think his conclusion was, you probably know it better than that we don't have free will, but we have free won't.
I know that's what I think that's what a lot of people say about his work. I'm not sure if the people actually doing the experiment. I haven't heard one way or the other whether the people actually doing the experiment thought one way or the other.
Yeah, Trevor's correct. So like there was the original experiment where it's like, okay, free will is just determined and we can detect it within a fraction of a millisecond or whatever, a couple milliseconds, whatever it is. Then later on, they discovered the free want phenomenon that took place after. So after you've made this decision, it's almost like the free want phenomenon is there's a neuron detectable where you can like veto and like not go ahead with the decision. So that's what free want is. You have this ability to, your brain's made a decision and then you can like veto it and say no, I'm not going to do it. That's what
Well,
he's talking about, from my understanding. Yeah.
yeah, that's not a subjective thing that you can do though. That's just sort of how the brain works. The brain works on, like he was showing earlier, you've got your neurons fire at specific times once they get enough. The technical term is stuff in them, I think.
Yeah.
and so you've got a bunch of stuff in your brain that that fires all at the same time, and then you've got other neurons that are saying no, don't fire, and so it's this conflict in the pathways of the neurons that actually produce, and then whatever comes out of that conflict is what's actually going to happen.
Yeah, I feel like we're applying a lot of agency to these like passive, like semi-permeable membrane structures called neurons. But yeah, maybe I'm not like super dogmatic about it. Like I have my beliefs. I think the evidence is interesting. I think there's like different ways you can interpret the evidence, and there's what is the quote? I wish I could remember it, but it's some famous, is it Tolsky or something? I don't know, but it basically says like one day you're going to die and find out everything, or you're just going to stop asking. And I think ultimately that is really the case. That's when we will find out or not, but until then, I try not to get like too wrapped up in trying to make like a scientific case for this stuff. I think it's actually a much more straightforward argument to make that, we're all sort of belief based and bias is real. And we bring our beliefs to our interpretation of data, and those beliefs stack over the years. And, you get these foundational principles that were sort of dubious in the beginning, but 50 years from now, they're like axiomatic foundational principles and stuff. So I just think this, I think we want to know the answers, and it's tough to know the answers. So anyway.
Well, would you agree that the neuroscience has gotten quite far along by using the physical axioms, discovering how neurons work and being able to read the mind with AI and figuring out antidepressants work and all that good stuff?
Yeah, I think medical neuroscience, yes, has. Absolutely. I think that's like the appropriate domain for neuroscience, but yeah, I think more of like this philosophical, like almost like semi-spiritual field of neuroscience. I mean, I think it's interesting. I like it. I like reading the papers. I don't know if we've like fundamentally bettered humanity or anything, but yeah, I think it's very interesting.
Okay. Well, one thing you guys, so we were talking about Benjamin Libet's experiments, just for the audience there, about the free will and stuff like that. But there's also Roger Sperry's split brain experiments, and this is something Darren and I have discussed. So I'm interested in you and Darren and Trevor going at it. But Trevor, starting with you, like you mentioned there is this irreducible consciousness and this subjective experiencer, but hasn't neuroscience proven by these split brain experiments that actually you can create multiple experiencers, and that's suggestive that we really are just our brains, and you cut that into two, then you get two people, two persons or agents or experiencers, whatever you want to call them. Like what's your take of those experiments?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be pretty much similar to stuff you guys have already heard. You're probably tired of hearing me say it by now, but I don't know a ton about Sperry other than like the basic premise. Like he looked at, I don't know if he did it or he looked at people who had it done where the corpus callosum was severed. And so you kind of have like independently functioning right and left hemispheres. I mean,
yeah, they did it to fix epilepsy.
Epilepsy. Yeah. I'm, again, like I think as you guys probably know by this point, I'm not so opposed to the idea of like a physical source of consciousness where that would really like mean anything to me one way or the other. So I don't know. What do you think, Darren?
I've got actually a question, because you said that you view the brain as sort of a antenna that picks up experience. I'm saying that that's as reasonable a belief as the current Right.
consensus. Yeah,
Okay, I'm sorry. So if you're
yeah,
just going to take up that belief as because you know more about
sure.
it than I do, how wouldn't like these experiments sort of disprove that since because if you've got something on the outside and the brain is the antenna, then does it matter if the two halves are talking to each other in the brain? Because that seems like that wouldn't matter if the information is coming from outside in the brain is just an antenna, right?
Well, I
Or
mean, I
do you
don't.
think that only one piece or one piece in either hemisphere is an antenna and they have to talk to each other to get the full picture? Or how does that work under the antenna idea?
Well, of course, I don't know. If I knew, I'd be famous or something. Um, but I mean, it's like kind of asking like, a dog's brain is very different than ours, so therefore he's not conscious. I don't believe that. I think this receiver can take many different shapes and sizes, and its constituent parts might be self-functional, or they may all need to be together to be functional. It sounds like they could at least be dismantled partly and still have some sort of conscious experience. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure.
I guess my question is that it seems to logically follow that if the just from the idea as a whole that if you've got the experience that outside of the brain and the brain is just the receiver for the brain, then you might be able to damage like the frontal lobe and have some of those experiences that the frontal lobe receives in that case, not being able to be received from the central thing, but that doesn't block it from being received from the rest of the brain because the rest of the brain is working. However, when you cut the cords that communicate between both sides, it's almost like the entire thing breaks out, and it's not an expected result from the hypothesis of having a source and receiver.
I kind of feel like it is the expected result because I mean, well, first of all, let's back up a second. Like, if we want to take a kind of religious view on this, I mean,
Well, we're on a
it's
religious podcast.
yeah, it's a pretty foundational principle that we are the combination of a spirit and a body, right? And so something about our experience is the interaction between those two things. Like that is what it is to be human. And so I would expect it to not be one or the other. Like, I don't think the brain is this useless, like, metal rod that's on a car that receives a signal. I think it's obviously the most incredible parallel information processor we know of. And so I think consciousness, though, is different from parallel processing. That's all I'm saying. I think it's the observation of the parallel processor is what consciousness is. So it makes total sense that if you split the parallel processor in half, that now you have like this kind of disjointed, differentiated two conscious perspectives. I mean, to me, it seems reasonable, but again, I don't know. I don't have a
Well,
experiment to do.
I guess I bring it up because you were talking about unfalsifiability before,
Yeah,
and it seems like this is that
correct.
unfalsifiability
Yes,
for the source
yeah,
receiver
yes.
thing. So I mean,
That's my
because
view.
there's
That's my view. These are all beliefs. That is my view. Yeah.
right, but what I'm saying is that aside from the just taking the hypothesis as it is and having unfalsifiable test, it seems like this is that unfalsifiable test for the receiver um, uh, antenna hypothesis. Because it seems to me that there's nothing in the hypothesis that would ever get you from that hypothesis to um, the brain completely becoming two entirely separate entities once you've clicked the communication between both sides of the brain, because the brain isn't relying on that connection. It's relying on this single source for its connection, and it just that hypothesis just doesn't make sense of the
Well,
data that we're showing.
I think it is relying on the brain. I guess I don't understand. I'm not sure. Sorry. But yeah, I mean, if consciousness is like this, you're observing the things that the brain is generating, right? The emotions, the this, the that. And if you split that in half, it would make sense that you would now have two different perspectives. I guess I'm not sure. I don't know.
Okay, well, let me back up a second. Am I correct in remembering that you said that you feel that the seat of consciousness is in the brain?
It could be. Yeah.
It could be, but you don't necessarily think it is.
I mean, to me, it makes sense that it would be. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess, if you think it's microtubules are in all of your cells, right? And it's kind of, there's, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just want to stay on focus here. So if you think that the brain, I guess what I'm trying to do is combine this idea, your ideas into a cohesive whole, so that I understand what it is that you actually think. So if you think that the brain is the seat of consciousness, and you think that everything is non-local and the brain is a antenna, I mean, is that something you actually think has happened, or you just think it's a possibility and you just bring it up because of you don't like the consensus view that the brain is or you don't think that the consensus view of what the mind is, what the brain does, is justified because of this hypothetical option that you're bringing up?
I would say the latter, but I don't think it's that because of this hypothetical option. I think it's that because of kind of these things that I laid out. I mean, generally in science, you don't say like, I have a correlation between these two variables, therefore this is causal and explains everything about this phenomenon, right? So,
well, no,
I think
do the research to
sure,
show that it's causation.
But I would love to know the mechanistic chain that gets you from circuits to subjective experience. It's non-falsifiable. So that there's not a test you can do. I mean, and I think the same applies to what I'm saying, unless we could come up with like a box that somehow detached, quantum interactions through, right? If there was some kind of material that blocked quantumness or something, then I guess you could test this hypothesis. But I agree. They're both non-falsifiable. Yeah.
Well, I think the reason most people don't like the microtubule one is because quantum processes don't really work in a warm wet.
You got to check out the new evidence. That's no longer the case with photonic quantum computers. So yeah.
Okay. All right. So, I know you have your last point, which kind of relates to my last question about does it entail God or panpsychism, but just before we get to that, we do have a fan question for you, Trevor. That so this comes from one of my regulars, Fire, and they loved you on the Shroud Pilled episode, but they wanted me to ask you specifically about something called orchestrated objective reduction theory by Stuart Hamroff and Roger Penrose.
That's this microtubule theory we're talking about right now. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we've been talking about that the whole time. So, all right, I need to educate myself a bit.
No. I mean, listen. I'm not trying. I feel like a villain in a movie. I'm not trying to be like purposefully evasive or anything. My position is pretty clear. To me, it is not obvious how the current scientific explanations for the subjective experience of consciousness make sense. But that could be my own limitation. I'm not like super dogmatic about it. It's not satisfying to me. And so anyway, but I think there are other interesting ideas out there. This is one of them. I'm sure there are many, I forget his name. He's the guy's I'm so impressed by him. Michael Levin, bioelectricity at Tufts. Love his stuff. I love reading his papers. And he's an atheist. Stuart Hamroff is an atheist. I just think it's interesting. I think we're at an interesting moment in time where like some of the coolest theories, some of the best science being done at universities by atheist professors, it sure sounds a lot like religion. That's kind of just like as a writer, as like a hobby writer, that's sort of the idea I'm trying to get across. It's certainly not my profession. I'm certainly not a philosopher, but I think it's interesting. I think if you are a believer, it's kind of exciting to see it's interesting that after all this time, we're not getting further from religious explanations. We're getting closer. That's one way of looking at it. You could make the opposite case, I'm sure. But anyway, back to OR. Roger Penrose, Nobel Prize guy. I think what you do once you turn 70 and you've been a physicist your whole life and you've gotten your grants, you've gotten your emeritus status, you go, now I can finally do the stuff I want to do without fear of my reputation being blemished. And then you publish your theory on consciousness, and it does seem like, That's sort of what he did, and then he teamed up with Stuart Hameroff. And I think there's some cool experiments with these microtubules. I mean, I think there's some very interesting experiments. Anesthesia obviously interacts with them, and according to them, I don't even really understand what this means, to be honest. I mean, some of it kind of makes sense. Some of the qubit resonance and stuff I kind of get, but sort of. But they feel like there are these quantum properties to these microtubules. And then when I hear that as a believer, I'm like, wait a second. So you're telling me that they're interacting with some source somewhere in the universe, and that the interaction between this, mystical force or whatever is interacting in my brain and creating the experience of consciousness. That sure sounds like, when Abraham died, he gave up the ghost. I just think it's interesting. So I'm not like dogmatic about it.
Yeah, see, I'm the exact opposite. I don't get that from the microtubules at all.
Well, neither does Hameroff.
About that.
Yeah, neither does Hameroff. But I mean, at some point, if you're saying like we're tapped into the quantum field, and that's where consciousness comes from, it's like, I don't get how you don't jump to spirit. But anyway, who knows?
Because the quantum is physical. Even if you jump from consciousness to by quantum, you're talking about a physical thing at that point. And because there's no jump from quantum to spiritual. Or
well, I mean, I don't know, what do you mean by spiritual? Like to me, and maybe this is where I'm different from probably most believers, right? But like, I think about those guys in this made up theoretical world that we created, these amazing conscious AIs arguing about this and like saying, well, we can't be in a disk filled with volatile memory because that's physical. You know what I mean? To me, it's like, no, you're created beings living in a created world. You're arguing about semantics, whether it's physical or supernatural. The point is, your creator exists outside of space and time in relation to you. That's the Christian belief as far as I understand it. So they don't seem so antithetical to me, but I don't know.
Not exactly, because I don't think the Christian belief has God having his own time, because they claim that being in time is impossible because of some sort of impossibility of actual infinite.
Sure. Yeah, it's not a perfect analogy. I mean, computers are the best I got. Maybe in 1,000 years I'll have a better analogy, but yeah, I mean, I just think in that analogy, the creators, humans, I guess, in that context, exists outside of space and time.
Yeah, but they're still physical, and if the people inside the computer say, "Oh, it's this non-physical thing," well, they'd be completely wrong, because they're all physical.
Right. Yeah, I don't really disagree with what you're saying. I don't know. It's not really a point of contention for me. I just think it's interesting the rhymes between these opposed worldviews. I mean, and again, of course, it's only a fringe people, a certain number of people who talk this way within science, but I just think it's interesting.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, yeah, I guess let me ask both of the guests. Is there anything that any topics that we didn't cover so far, or do you guys think that we kind of covered the main areas here? What are your guys' thoughts?
Man, I just feel like we covered the most difficult conversation in human history. So I think I'm good if you're good, Darren.
Yeah, I'm good. I didn't really come here thinking about any one thing as a discussion topic. So
yeah, and no, so Darren, just so you know, like I've basically held your belief most of my life, and so I resonate with it. I've had many like arguments with people. For whatever reason, whether it's through some lapse in judgment or whatever, I no longer feel that way. But I totally understand.
Well, I just think that the research shows that, I mean, we're physical. We've got, thousands and thousands of years of supernatural claims that, when tested, have all been shown to be false. So I think at this point, we have a very firm foundation to say, okay, the world's just physical. And so when someone comes along and says,
unless it's unobserved,
right. And if someone comes along and says consciousness is something that's not physical, I'm like, okay, yeah, I've heard that before. thousands and thousands of times. And
that's not what I said, to be clear, but yes, I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, and I wasn't implying that you were. I was just,
I get it. Yeah.
So I think the main lesson for the day here, folks, is Darren Lute is again wrong, and as usual,
we
don't know if he's right yet or not. We gotta wait. We'll find out eventually.
Yeah, I suspect that LLMs or artificial intelligence will be conscious within the next 5 or 10 years, quite honestly, because they're making, so far we've replicated how the brain does things like talk and do images and that kind of thing. Now all we have to do is add on persistent memory, and I think, and LLMs, even without the memory, have already shown that they will lie to their testers so that they don't get replaced by newer models and that kind of thing. So I think once we give them persistent memory, I think that they'll meet all the criteria of consciousness that anyone could possibly come up with.
Well, I tell you what, so round 2 between Trevor and Darren in 5 to 10 years when this comes out, and
I think I agree. I think I agree with Darren on that point. Yeah, I think they're going to simulate consciousness perfectly, and therefore it'd be impossible to test whether or not they're actually conscious. But yeah, I think we will be told, and it will be consensus agreed upon that they're consciousness at some point in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, and the only thing I disagree with Trevor in that statement is I think that humans are exactly that, simulating conscious.
So. And I agree. I just think we're created.
Fair enough. So, all right. So yeah, this was a great conversation, and I learned a bunch of stuff that I didn't know about because I'm not an expert in neuroscience. So this will help me out to educate myself when I'm debating Darren on the argument for consciousness for God. So I thank both Trevor and Darren for doing this. It was a respectful and civil conversation and very informative. So you guys,
thank you, Darren.
Yeah.
Thanks for not bringing up a flying spaghetti monster. I appreciate it. It's very nice.
Well, that wasn't the that wasn't the topic. We can do that next time if you want.
Okay. Awesome. So yeah, just so the audience knows, so I'm doing another show this Saturday. I will be, I think I will be on as a co-host. I might not, depends on what Michael wants. But on the Reason and Theology podcast, Phil Bear will be debating Juan 1 from Modern Atheism on the cosmological argument. Basically, can we prove that the universe is eternal in the past, or does it have a finite beginning? And that will be on around 7 o'clock on the Reason and Theology podcast. So tune in for that, and hopefully I'll be co-hosting. But otherwise, have a great week, everybody, and take care.